Midnight came with thunder, but the skies were dry. No rain, no wind, just the sound of angry drums from the clouds. Doors creaked open, curtains shifted. From every corner, whispers rose like smoke. Eyes peeked out into the darkness. Thunder with no rain? The gods are angry. Bare feet slapped the ground. Rappers flew. An old voice screamed through the village square, shaking the silence. Wake up! Wake up! The spirits are here! Her arms flailed. Her eyes were wild. It's happening again, the shrine hut groaned. From inside came a sound not meant for human ears. It wasn't crying, it wasn't screaming, it was something in between, a cry that bent the ears and froze the heart. She's in labor, someone shouted, but she wasn't pregnant yesterday. Inside that old hut, something sacred broke. A gasp filled the air. 1, 2, 3, breath counted the arrivals. No, 12. The old woman held her head. Her knees failed. 6 boys, 6 girls. What kind of womb is this? No blood, no struggle, just stillness. Then the screams of newborns filled the sky like birds fleeing fire. The village ran. Lanterns swung like frightened eyes. 12, they whispered. What does this mean? One voice cracked, this is not birth, this is a curse. Another hissed, no, maybe a sign. One child blinked. His eyes were not black, not brown, but red like fire trapped in glass. Another yawned, and behind her ears shimmered small, wet scales like river stones. A woman dropped her basket. A child ran. Abomination, someone shouted. These are not ordinary children. A tall figure raised his hand. His staff hit the ground. Silence, he thundered. His voice cut through the noise. This is not childbirth. This is a message. But from who? The crowd trembled. No one answered. All across the land, the animals froze. Dogs stopped barking. Goats held their breath. Even the crickets, bold as they were, vanished. A single cock crowed, and then nothing. The night swallowed the world. Amid the panic, one woman stood, her eyes calm, her arms full of children. 12, each quiet now as if waiting. They are here for a reason, she said, her voice soft but strong. You may not understand, but I do. She looked at no one. She waited for no blessing. She turned. I know what I must do. And with the 12 in her arms, she walked into the dark. Not a single step faltered, no tears, no words, just purpose. The villagers watched, feet rooted to the earth, tongues frozen. No one dared stop her. No one moved. Only their eyes followed, wide and full of fear. Behind her, the thunder cracked once more. Still no rain. Ngozi was just 8 when she became an orphan. Her parents' house, once filled with laughter, was now cold and empty, swallowed by the shadows of the village. But the villagers weren't cruel. They sent her to Mama Chinwe, the herbalist who took her in like a daughter. Mama Chinwe was wise with herbs and roots, but it was her strength, her sharp tongue that made the village respect her. Ngozi, though, was different. From the beginning, her spirit was strong. She was sharp-witted and determined, always quick with a comeback, never afraid to speak her mind. But the village women saw only one thing, the empty basket. They mocked her, laughed behind her back. She was married at 18, and as the years passed, the whispers grew louder. 10 years. 10 long years of marriage to Obinna, a struggling palm wine tapper who climbed trees all day and brought down sweet thick sap every evening. They had everything but a child. No one believed it was possible for someone so strong-willed to remain barren. Her womb is like a dried river, the women would say, empty and cold. They didn't understand her pain, and neither did she. The village's pitying looks didn't help. For 10 years, there was nothing. But Obinna stood by her. Every day, he climbed his palm trees, returning late with the sweet wine that made his customers' tongues loosen. Every night, he watched his wife cry in silence. It will happen, he would say. But his heart, too, was tired of waiting, tired of watching her heart break every month. Still, he stayed. For years, he held her, tried to soothe her. It will happen, he whispered, though even he wasn't sure he believed it anymore. Then came the day when the village nurse stood over her, shaking her head. You were pregnant? She asked, disbelief in her voice. Ngozi's voice was steady. I never went to the hospital, she answered. But your belly? A neighbor spat. How did it grow? We saw nothing. I did not hide it. Nobody touched me. Ngozi's answer was simple, but it was not the answer they wanted to hear. The women exchanged uneasy glances. They didn't believe her. The whispers started, first among the women, then the men. She went to the river too many times, they muttered. She went to the water, and now this. No one had seen her belly grow, not even Obina. No one knew how it was possible. How could a woman stay silent for months and then suddenly have 12 children? 12. No one could understand it. She is using marine powers, a woman said, fear creeping into her voice. She has made a deal with the river spirits. The priest didn't wait long to act. Priest Uba stood in the village square, his voice rising above the murmurs of the crowd. "This is not natural," he said, his eyes sharp. "One baby is a blessing, but 12 is a warning." The drums began to beat, deep and rhythmic, calling the gods to the village. The priests had made their decision. The babies were a threat, and the spirits must be appeased. "A sacrifice must be made," Priest Uba declared. "We must restore balance." But Obina could not bear it. Standing in the middle of the square, he dropped to his knees, his face a mask of frustration and grief. "I just wanted one child, one." His voice broke. "Now I have 12, and I don't even know how." His hands dug through his hair as tears rolled down his face. The people around him did not comfort him. Instead, they turned their eyes on Ngozi, waiting for answers. But she had none to give. "I owe nobody answers," Ngozi said quietly. Her eyes never wavered. Her voice was calm, but there was something unyielding in her words. She would not explain herself. She would not give in to their demands. Her silence was like fuel on a fire. The villagers' fear grew, and in their fear, their whispers grew louder. "She has to answer for this," they muttered. "This cannot be allowed." But Ngozi said nothing. She only stared at the 12 children in her arms, the children no one understood, the children no one could explain. And in the quiet of the night, the past came knocking. The wind shifted, and in a dream, Ngozi found herself back in the forest. The trees hummed with energy, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and moss. She knelt before an old woman, the one who had been there when she made her choice. The old woman's face was lined with age, her eyes bright and piercing. "Do you want children?" the woman had asked. "Yes," Ngozi had whispered, the desire raw in her voice. "More than anything." The old woman smiled, but it was not a kind smile. "There is a price," she said. "Not in blood, but in choice." "I accept anything," Ngozi replied, eager, desperate for the promise of children, for the chance to fill the empty space inside her. The wind stirred, black and cold, and in that moment, the deal was sealed. No words had been spoken, but Ngozi understood. There would be a price, one that would come due and soon. Back in the present, the forest spirits stirred once again. The shadows stretched long across Ngozi's compound. The village was watching her, waiting for her to explain, to break the silence. But she could not. The past was catching up, and the promise she had made was about to unravel. The price had come due. 1 week passed since the strange birth. The village could no longer ignore what had happened. The babies, those 12 strange children, were growing at a terrifying speed. They had started speaking within days, and it was not the simple babbling of infants. No, these children spoke in tongues that no one could understand. "Mama," one baby said, but the next word it spoke was thunderous, like a storm had been trapped in its small mouth. The others joined in, their voices blending together. A chorus not of this world, each word twisted in an unnatural rhythm. The villagers watched in terror, huddling together in their homes, wondering what had happened to Ngozi's children. Some whispered that the river spirits had taken hold of them, that their cries were the voice of gods long forgotten. Then, one night, another strange event occurred. Ngozi's scream shattered the stillness of the evening. One of the children had disappeared. She ran through the house, calling out to the others, but the baby was gone. Her heart raced in her chest. What had happened? Where was the child? The moon rose high, casting its pale light across the village as the night stretched on. By morning, the baby had returned. The villagers gathered, eyes wide with shock, as Ngozi held the child in her arms. But the sight that greeted them was something they could not have imagined. The baby was smiling, a wide, innocent grin, but wrapped around its small body was a massive python, its scales glistening in the morning sun. The snake slithered away, its movements calm, as if it had never been disturbed. The baby giggled, completely at ease, and the villagers stood frozen, mouths agape. The whispers began again, louder this time. "It is not a child, it is a spirit," they said. "No normal child walks with a snake." Fear gripped the village like a vice. This was no longer about the 12 strange births. Something far darker had taken root. Ngozi retreated into the shadows of the forest, away from prying eyes. With her bare hands, she built a small hut on the edge of the woods. The villagers watched, nervous and confused, as she worked silently, day after day. The hut was made of mud and branches, a simple structure that seemed to pulse with strange energy. No visitors, Ngozi declared, her voice cold and distant, not even family. And no one dared to challenge her. Each night, a strange fire burned outside the hut, casting eerie shadows that danced and flickered in the darkness. The smoke that rose from it was thick, filled with the scent of herbs and something else, something no one could name. But the villagers knew one thing for certain: they were no longer in control of this situation. Chief Okonkwo, troubled by the growing mystery, summoned his council. "Send spies," he ordered. "We must know what she is doing." 3 men were chosen, brave souls who had been willing to face whatever lay in the shadows. But none of them returned the same. The first man came back silent, his eyes wide, and his mouth shut tight as if locked in fear. The second man returned laughing, his mind clearly broken, muttering to himself and clutching his head as though trying to shake off a terrible dream. The third man was the worst. He returned blind, his eyes hollow, empty, as though he had gazed into something too terrifying to behold. "I saw them," he whispered, trembling, "but they saw me first." Fear spread like wildfire through the village. No one understood what was happening. No one could explain the horrors unfolding before their eyes. But one thing was certain: the village was no longer safe. Obinna, in his confusion and pain, could not remain silent any longer. He burst into the hut, his fists clenched, his voice a mixture of anger and desperation. "What are you hiding, Ngozi?" he demanded. "What have you brought into my house? These are not children. I don't know what they are, but they are not children." Ngozi stood still, her face calm, her eyes unwavering. "They are more than children," she replied, her voice cold but filled with something else, something ancient. "They came to correct what the world has spoiled." Her words hung in the air like a heavy cloud. She refused to say more, locking the door behind her and leaving Obinna standing outside, helpless and confused. He had no answers. He had no way of understanding what had happened to his wife, to their life. The woman he loved had changed, and the children, those 12 strange children, were not the innocent infants he had imagined. Days passed without any word from Ngozi. The villagers watched in fear as smoke rose from the hut every night. Strange chants echoed across the village, low and haunting, filling the air with a sense of dread. "She has gone mad," the villagers whispered among themselves. "She is not who she once was." Desperate to put an end to this, Chief Okonkwo summoned the prophet from the hills, a man known for his deep connection to the spirits. The elders agreed that only the prophet could see the true nature of what had taken root in their village. The drums beat and the message was sent: the prophet must come at once. When the prophet arrived, he did not speak a word. He prayed, his hands raised to the heavens, and then, with a deep breath, he entered the hut. He barely took a step inside before he screamed, a sound so sharp and filled with terror that it froze the blood of all who heard it. He ran out, his eyes wide with fear. "They are not from this world," he cried. "Burn the hut before it's too late." The villagers, now completely convinced of the unnatural power within the hut, prepared torches. The men sharpened their sticks, the women clutched charms for protection. "This is the only way," they chanted. "We must burn it. We must destroy it before it destroys us." The forest trembled beneath their feet as they marched toward the hut, their steps quick and uncertain. But as they neared, the door to the hut opened, and Ngozi emerged. She stood in the doorway, calm as ever, 2 babies in her arms. She held them with the same care, the same calm expression as she had held them the day they were born. The village froze as they saw her standing there, unmoving, her eyes locked on them. "Touch this hut, and your hands will rot," she said, her voice clear and unshaken. The air grew thick, the wind swirling around her like a storm had begun to form. Behind her, lightning flashed across the sky, crackling like the heavens themselves were answering her call. "I will do what I was called to do," she said, her voice now stronger, louder, almost as if it was not just her speaking. "Whether you accept it or not." The villagers stood paralyzed, unable to move, unable to speak. And then, as quickly as she had appeared, Ngozi disappeared into the forest, the 12 children following closely behind her. The trees seemed to close behind her, and the ground shook slightly, as though the earth itself was trying to hold her back. But no one dared follow her. The village was silent for a long time after she left. Chief Okonkwo stood alone, his face grim. "She is no longer one of us," he said quietly. "She is a curse." The shrines were cleansed. Her name was never spoken again. But in every shadow, in every corner of the village, people still whispered her story. Some said she was a blessing. Others said she was a curse. But no one could deny one thing. The world had changed that night, and it would never be the same again. 7 years later, Umokoro falls into darkness. The sky over Umokoro was perpetually overcast, a dull gray that seemed to drain all color from the land. The once fertile fields, which had provided sustenance for the entire village, now lay barren. The yam crops, the pride of Umokoro, had shriveled before harvest. The palm trees, once heavy with sap, now wept black tears. And the river, which had always been the lifeblood of the village, had turned to dust. The villagers could only watch in helplessness as the land, once rich and full of promise, withered away. Children coughed blood. The elders whispered in hushed tones, their eyes wide with fear. "We are cursed," they muttered, and the words seemed to echo in the silence that hung heavily over the village. "The curse of Ngozi," they said, "the curse of the children." Crops rot and the ground cracks. Days bled into weeks and the situation grew worse. The yams that had once been a source of joy and pride now lay rotting in the fields, and the palm trees bled black sap instead of the sweet nectar that had once flowed freely. The drummers, who had always been the keepers of messages, could no longer interpret the strange rhythms that beat from their drums. No one knew what the messages meant anymore. The sky stayed gray, and the ground cracked underfoot, as if the earth itself was rejecting the village. Chief Okonkwo gathers the elders. Inside the village council hut, the air was thick with tension. Chief Okonkwo, his face drawn with worry, gathered the elders. They sat in silence, all too aware of the events that had transpired 7 years earlier. "We should not have chased her away," the chief finally said, his voice quiet, as if the words themselves were too painful to speak. There was a long, uncomfortable pause, the weight of the past hanging heavily between them. "We have no choice now," he continued. "Send someone, before it's too late." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room, but no one spoke louder than the silence that followed. "Young messenger Chike." From the back of the room, a young voice spoke up. It was Chike, the son of the blind spy, a boy who had grown into a man in the years since the curse had fallen upon Umokoro. "I will go," he said, his voice firm and steady, despite the fear that twisted in his gut. His mother, sitting beside him, began to weep. "No," she cried, "do not go. You are my only son. Do not seek out that evil." His father, the man who had once returned from the forest blind, placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Let him try," he said quietly, his voice thick with the understanding of what Chike was about to face. "The village has nothing left. He must go." And so, with only a staff and a handful of kola nuts, Chike left at dawn, stepping into the forest that had once been the heart of the village, now twisted and alien. The forest paths have changed. The forest had changed since the days Ngozi had left. The trees that had once been solid and unyielding now moved like serpents, shifting their roots and branches to block his way. The path twisted and coiled, confusing his sense of direction. The air was thick with an unnatural presence, and every time Chike took a step, the whisper of voices seemed to call his name, echoing through the leaves. "Ngozi," they whispered, but the voice was not hers. It was something older, something far more ancient. Chike pressed on, determined. For 3 days he walked without sleep, guided only by the echoes of those whispers and his deep need to find Ngozi, to bring an end to the darkness that threatened to consume the village. A glowing compound appears in the mist. On the 4th day, as the sun began to set, Chike stumbled upon something unexpected. A glow appeared in the distance, like a soft light in the mist. The trees parted, and before him stood a compound like no other. It was not made of stone or mud, but of light and ash, the walls shimmering as if they were woven from the very air. 12 figures stood guard, silent and unmoving. They were like shadows in the light, their eyes glowing faintly, their bodies radiating an aura of power that sent a chill through Chike's spine. They did not blink, did not move. Their eyes followed him as he approached, but they made no sound. The children have become warriors of light and shadow. As Chike stepped closer, the figures began to reveal themselves. They were no longer the children he had once seen, but young warriors, each radiating light and shadow. 6 glowed like the sun itself, their skin bright as if lit from within. The other 6 were dark, their forms rippling like the night, their eyes piercing through Chike's very soul. Their presence was overwhelming, and Chike could feel their power thrumming in the air. It was as though they were no longer human, but something far beyond. Beings of light and darkness, guardians of a balance no one in the village could comprehend. Ngozi stands between them, older but unshaken. And then, standing between them, was Ngozi. She was older, her face marked by time, but there was no mistaking her. Her eyes, once full of fear and doubt, now held a quiet strength. She stood with a calmness that was almost otherworldly, her feet not touching the ground. "You have returned too late," she said, her voice carrying a weight that Chike could feel deep in his bones. "But we will listen." The judgment is revealed. Chike took a step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "Please," he begged. "The village is dying. We did not know. We beg for mercy." Ngozi's gaze softened, but her words were unyielding. "Each child holds a judgment," she said, her voice calm but filled with the power of the gods themselves. 6 were born for mercy, 6 for wrath. You all chose wrath when you burned trust. The words hit Chike like a physical blow. He had known, deep down, that the villagers' actions had been wrong, but hearing them spoken aloud with such finality left him with no hope of redemption. The gods had sent the children to test the hearts of men, and the village had failed. The purpose of the birth is explained. Ngozi's voice grew softer as she continued. The gods sent them to test hearts. They were born to teach mercy, but your fear, your hatred, drove them to wrath. You feared what you didn't understand. You hated what you should have loved. Chike fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. "Please," he whispered. "We didn't know. Please help us." One of the children stepped forward, a young girl with eyes as green as the earth itself. Her hand glowed with an emerald light. "Then let us see for ourselves," she said, her voice like the rustle of leaves in the wind. The children returned to Umwokoro at dawn. At dawn, the children returned to Umwokoro. The wind carried their voices, sweet and haunting, and as they approached the village, the earth seemed to tremble beneath their feet. Half the village fainted at the sight of them, some from fear, others from awe. The others knelt, their hearts heavy with remorse. 6 bring healing and rain. The children who glowed like the sun stepped forward first. As they walked through the village, clouds gathered overhead, dark and full with the promise of rain. One child touched the dry ground, and within moments, sprouts began to rise from the cracked earth. The 6 stood up, whole again, their strength returned to them. The village was washed in the rain, the land beginning to heal. 6 bring fire and darkness. But the other 6, those who rippled like the night, followed behind. Their hands ignited with flames, and as they raised them, fire spread across the village, burning away the lies and greed that had plagued it. Liars and greedy men fell screaming to the ground, and the houses of wickedness crumbled to ash. Chief Okonkwo tries to run, but falls. Chief Okonkwo, realizing that his time had come, tried to run, his feet stumbling as he fled from the wrath he had so long ignored. "Forgive me," he cried, his voice breaking, but the wrath child was already upon him. "Too late," it whispered, and the fire surged around him, consuming him completely. Balance is restored at a price. Half the village was gone, reduced to ash, but half had been reborn. The land, once barren, now teemed with life. The people of Umwokoro knelt in awe, for they had seen the power of the gods. They had witnessed the judgment of mercy and wrath, and they knew they could never forget it. Ngozi stood at the hilltop, watching silently as the village was transformed. Her task was complete. The price had been paid, and balance had been restored. The people fall to their knees in awe. As the drums began to play once more, the villagers rose to their feet, their heads bowed in reverence. Children chanted the new names of the 12, and for the first time in 7 years, peace returned to Umwokoro. The people wept, But these were tears of gratitude, for they had learned the most important lesson of all: the power of mercy, the weight of judgment, and the cost of fear. The village of Umuokoro had already begun to heal, its once barren fields now rich with life, and its people bound by a newfound unity. But the return of Ngozi was met with silence. As she walked through the village barefoot, dust swirling at her feet, there were no drums, no cheering. The air was heavy with anticipation, but no one dared speak. Her face was calm, unreadable, as she walked past the villagers who stood watching, unsure whether they should approach or stay in reverence. There was no need for words. Her presence alone seemed to carry the weight of everything the village had endured. Obinna crawls to her feet, weeping. At the center of the village, Obinna, the man who had once been its chief and had led the charge to cast Ngozi away, crawled on his knees toward her. His beard was gray, his eyes hollow with regret and the passage of time. When he reached her, he fell to the ground, weeping uncontrollably. "Forgive me," he sobbed, his voice breaking. "I was a fool. We were all fools. I destroyed us." Ngozi looked down at him. Her gaze was not one of anger or condemnation, but understanding. "You feared what you could not carry," she said softly, her words cutting deep into the heart of the man who had once ruled the village. "The past cannot return," Ngozi's words cut deep. The villagers waited for the next words to come, the weight of the past pressing down on them all. Ngozi's voice, steady and unyielding, broke the silence. "The past cannot return," she said. Her words were firm, like thunder rolling over the land. "But the future can be repaired." Obinna bowed his head in sorrow, but there was no plea in his eyes anymore. There was only the understanding that redemption was not his to claim alone. "Help us try," he whispered, the words barely escaping his lips. The 12 children stepped forward as guides. The 12 children, now fully grown into their powers, stepped forward from the shadows. 6 of them stood to the left, bathed in a radiant light, while 6 stood to the right, cloaked in the darkness that once represented their wrath. Together, they formed a perfect circle of balance. "We will not rule," one of them spoke, their voice clear and strong. "We will teach." The villagers nodded, the promise of hope flickering in their hearts. These children were not gods, not rulers, but guides, beacons of the wisdom they had learned from their trials. A new beginning in Umokoro. With the children's guidance, Umokoro began to transform. The fields, once withered, now bloomed again, bursting with life. The sick, who had been lingering in the shadows of despair, stood tall, dancing in the rain that now washed over the village. The sun shone brighter, and the air was sweeter, as if the land itself had forgiven them. Children, their faces alight with joy, began to learn, not just the old ways, but new ones. They gathered under the trees, reading from simple scrolls of paper, their minds opening to the world beyond what they had known. The village builds its first school. A school, the first of its kind in the region, began to take shape in the center of Umuokoro. Clay bricks rose quickly under the hands of the villagers, each brick symbolizing a piece of their collective effort to rebuild. One of the children, the one who had glowed with the green light of life, drew letters in the sand. "From this place," Ngozi said, standing on a nearby hill, "wisdom will flow." The school was more than just a building. It was the foundation of a new era, an era where knowledge, compassion, and unity would guide Umokoro's future. Fear melts, unity rises. Gone were the days of fear and suspicion. The village no longer lived in terror of what the gods might bring, nor did they cower under the oppressive rule of greed and selfishness. Elders and youths worked side by side, sharing tools and labor under the sun. The drums, which had once been used to warn of doom, now beat to celebrate, to mark the days of prosperity. The village, no longer driven by fear, was now led by truth. The fear that had once torn them apart had melted away, replaced by the unity they had longed for. Ngozi watches from the hill one last time. Ngozi stood on a hill overlooking the village, staff in hand, her eyes scanning the children, the homes, and the sky. She had done what she came to do. The village was reborn, and its people, once fractured, were now bound together in purpose. Her work was complete. Obinna tries to follow her, but stops. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the village, Obinna made his way up the hill toward Ngozi. He stopped a few paces behind her, his voice filled with both longing and understanding. "Will you stay?" he called out, his voice carrying across the distance between them. But Ngozi did not turn. She stood still, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "My work is done?" she replied, her voice soft but firm. There was no sadness in her words, only a quiet acceptance of the path she had walked. She walks into the forest barefoot. Ngozi took a final step away from the village. Barefoot, she walked into the forest, the trees parting silently to make way for her. A soft wind circled around her, carrying with it the fragrance of the earth and the whispers of the past. She hummed a familiar tune, the song her mother had once sung to her, a lullaby of the forest, a whisper from the leaves. As she walked deeper into the forest, a soft whisper came from the leaves above her. "You have done well." The forest seemed to glow faintly in the twilight, as if it recognized the peace that had come to Umokoro. Ngozi smiled, her eyes closed, her heart at peace. Ngozi fades into the trees, never seen again. And then, as quietly as she had arrived, Ngozi faded into the trees. No footprints remained, no sound echoed through the forest. The only sign of her passage was the deep, unspoken feeling that peace had finally come to the village. The villagers never saw her again, but they never forgot her. And in the years to come, the name of Ngozi was spoken with reverence. Her legacy, a reminder of the power of mercy, of transformation, and of the strength found in unity. Village Eldership. The night of the Moon Festival had come again to Umokoro. The air was thick with the scent of roasted yam and the sound of laughter, but this year there was something different. The villagers gathered around the great fire, a fire that had once symbolized their fear, now burning with hope and reflection. The new chief stood before them, his carved staff held high. He spoke, his voice clear and steady, carrying across the crowd. "Let the truth be spoken without fear," he declared, his words cutting through the night air like a blade. "We judged wrong," the chief confesses. As the chief lowered his staff, his voice trembled with the weight of years lost. "We cursed a blessing," he said, his eyes lowering in shame, "because we did not understand it." The elders around the fire nodded in quiet acknowledgement, their faces etched with the wisdom of the past. They, too, had been blind in their fear, and now they understood the depth of their mistake. Lessons burned into Umokoro's memory. The chief's words rang out, and the weight of the lessons settled over the villagers like a blanket. "Fear blinded even our oldest eyes," he continued. "Ignorance turned friends into enemies. We mistook light for darkness." The villagers stood in somber silence, the truth of those words sinking into their hearts. They had learned at great cost that fear could cloud judgment, and that true understanding required more than a glance. It required an open heart and a willingness to listen. "Not every strange thing is evil." From the crowd, a mother stepped forward, her face weathered by time but softened by wisdom. "I feared her," she whispered, casting her gaze to the ground. "I feared what she brought. But now, my child walks because of her." Her words resonated deeply with the villagers. They had feared what they did not understand, but now they saw with clearer eyes. What they had once cast away had returned to heal them. Truth needs listening, not judgment. A priest, his robes adorned with symbols of the gods, stood up slowly. "We were too loud to hear her truth," he said, his voice soft but filled with sorrow. "Next time, we must listen first." The crowd fell into silence again, and the priest's words stirred a change in them all. They understood that truth is not always loud. It is quiet, often hidden beneath the surface, waiting to be heard. A curse may be the answer to a prayer. An old woman, her back bent from years of toil, lifted her head. "She came with what we prayed for. Children, healing, light," she said, her voice thick with regret. "But we chased it into the forest." The village fell still. The truth of her words was undeniable. What they had feared and rejected was, in fact, the answer to their deepest prayers, and they had cast it away in the name of fear. The story of Ngozi lives on. As the fire crackled and the moonlight bathed the land, children gathered by the fireside, their eyes wide with wonder. Griots began to sing, their voices rising into the night. "She gave birth to 12, and the world changed," they sang. The story of Ngozi becoming a song that would echo through the generations. The drums beat softly under the stars, carrying the message of transformation and understanding. The 12 still walk among us. The elders often spoke in hushed tones, saying that the 12 still walked among them, Some claimed they saw them in their dreams, their faces shrouded in mystery. Others said they glimpsed them in the marketplace, silent, watching, never speaking, but always knowing. Their eyes carried the weight of a wisdom that could never be explained, only felt. When a child is born with a gift. Now, when a child is born with a gift, whether it be of healing, strength, or wisdom, the elders look closely. They whisper among themselves, maybe this one is part of the 12. And they treat the child with care, for they know that the gift may carry within it a power that could change their world once again. Final words before the fire dies. As the festival came to a close, the chief stood tall, his eyes scanning the villagers who now looked at him with hope instead of fear. He raised his hand, and the crowd fell silent. "Let fear never lead us again," he said, his voice carrying the final weight of the night. "Let us remember that understanding, not fear, is the true path to wisdom." The people bowed their heads in quiet promise, a vow to themselves and to their children. And as the fire flickered one last time, they knew that the future of Umwokoro would no longer be shaped by fear, but by the truth they had learned and the unity they had built.